cameras were rolling on a live Family Feud taping when Brandon Hewitt, 41, regional sales director, leaned toward the microphone during Steve Harvey's opening banter and said, with the easy smile of a man who has spent 20 years performing competence in rooms where competence is measured by how far you've traveled from where you started, "Frank's a good man. Salt of the earth. You know the type. Worked the plant his whole life. Didn't quite make it out, but he did all right." He said it about his father-in-law, who was standing 2 feet to his right. Frank Pickard, 68 years old, retired shift supervisor, heard every word. He did not react. He stood with his hands folded over the leather portfolio he had carried to the taping, worn at the corners, the clasp replaced twice in 12 years, and he looked straight ahead with the particular stillness of a man who has heard himself reduced before and has decided long ago that the reduction says nothing about him and everything about the person performing it. Odessa, his wife, beside him, did the same. Steve Harvey, standing 6 feet away, heard every word too. He did not react either, not immediately. He looked at Brandon with an expression that was not anger, but something more patient than anger. The expression of a man who knows something the room doesn't know yet and is deciding exactly when and how to use it. The audience's laughter at Brandon's comment was thin and brief, the kind that happens when people aren't sure they're supposed to find something funny and choose the social safety of a short sound over the discomfort of silence. Steve let the thin laughter land and dissipate. Then he said, "Frank, what's in the portfolio?" Brandon's smile did not disappear immediately. It took about 2 seconds, which was exactly how long it took him to understand that whatever was about to happen, he had started it. Frank Pickard had carried the portfolio to the taping because it was what he did. He had carried it to every meeting that mattered for 31 years. To the bank when they refinanced the house in 2004 to pay for Tanya's junior year. To the financial aid office at the university 3 separate times. To the scholarship committee twice. To the meeting with the Pell Grant coordinator when the first disbursement had not arrived and Tanya's enrollment was at risk, and Frank had sat across from a 24-year-old administrator and explained, with full composure, why the paperwork was correct and the disbursement needed to happen that week. He carried the portfolio because it contained the documentation of his family's choices, and he had learned early that documentation was the only argument available to people like him in rooms built for people unlike him. Inside the portfolio, organized in plastic sleeves and paper clipped in sets, were 12 years of financial aid correspondence. The deed to the house, refinanced twice. The letter from the manufacturing plant's credit union approving the personal loan of $14,000 he had taken in 2006 to cover Tanya's senior year after the scholarship was not renewed. The loan repayment records, paid off in full in 2011, 4 years ahead of schedule. Tanya's degree, and one other document, in a separate sleeve at the back. A letter of professional reference, written in Frank's careful block print on plain white paper, addressed to the hiring manager of a pharmaceutical sales company in Charlotte, North Carolina, on behalf of a young man named Brandon Hewitt, who had been dating his daughter for 2 years, and who had asked Frank, quietly, over the phone one evening, if Frank would write something on his behalf because Frank had worked with one of the company's regional directors at the plant, and Frank knew him, and Brandon did not know anyone yet, and this job was the one he needed. Frank had written the letter. He had written 2 drafts. He had asked Odessa to read both. She had said the second one was better. He had mailed it on a Tuesday. He had never mentioned it to Brandon again, because that was not why he had written it. Brandon had gotten the job. It was his first real position. The career he had built for 12 years, the promotions, the territory expansions, the regional directorship, traced directly to that first position in Charlotte. He knew this. He had known it in the way that people know things they have decided not to examine. He had told himself, gradually, over 12 years of increasing success, the story of a man who had built something by himself, through his own effort and intelligence, which was true in many ways and incomplete in one specific way that he had chosen not to include in the story. He had not thanked Frank for the letter. He had not mentioned it at their wedding, or at the baby shower, or at the dinner where Frank and Odessa had given them the down payment for the house, which was $22,000, a number that represented 4 years of Odessa's retirement contributions from her school secretary's salary, withdrawn early and gifted without condition. He had not mentioned any of it, because acknowledging it would have required adjusting the story, and the story was the thing he had built his identity on. And identities built on incomplete stories are surprisingly fragile and require constant maintenance. Tanya had married Brandon knowing all of this. She had watched her parents give, and watched her husband receive, and had told herself it was gratitude he felt. Just unexpressed, the way some men were, not absent, just internal. She had been telling herself this for 12 years. She had come to Family Feud because her mother had suggested it as a fun thing to do together, which it was, which it had been in Odessa's mind when she suggested it, which was the only thing it ever was in Odessa's mind, because Odessa's mind did not carry grudges, having made the decision long ago that carrying what other people owed you was weight she could not afford. Backstage, Frank had held the portfolio and not said anything for the 20 minutes before the taping. Odessa had straightened her blouse, a habit, something she had been doing since Frank was old enough to need it applied to someone else, and she had looked at her husband and said, "You don't have to bring that in." Frank had said, "I always bring it." She had said, "I know." He had said, "It's just what I do." She had said, "I know, baby." They had walked out together. Steve looked at Frank. He said, "The portfolio. Tell me what's in it." Brandon said, "Steve, it's just, he keeps old paperwork. It's a thing he does." Steve did not look at Brandon. He kept his eyes on Frank. He said, "Frank, what's in it?" Frank set the portfolio on the podium. He opened the clasp. He did not take anything out. He said, 12 years of making sure my daughter got where she was going. He said it plainly, without performance. Every document, every loan, every application, everything. He looked at Steve. "I bring it because I don't want to forget what it cost. It's good to remember what things cost." The studio fell completely silent. And that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. Steve said, "Is there a letter in there?" Frank looked at him. He said, "How do you know about that?" Steve said, "Your daughter mentioned it in the pre-show interview. She said she found out about it 3 years ago. She said you never told her you wrote it." Frank said, "Wasn't her letter to know about?" Steve said, "Can you tell the room what letter it is?" Frank looked at Brandon. Brandon had gone very still. The smile was entirely gone now. Not replaced by shame, but by something more specific. The expression of a man who is watching a piece of information cross a room toward him that he has been managing the distance of for 12 years. Frank said, "When Brandon was starting out, he asked me to write him a reference letter for a job. I knew somebody at the company. I wrote the letter. He got the job. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without decoration. That's it." Steve said, "That's not it, Frank. What job was it?" Frank said, "His first real position. In Charlotte." Steve looked at Brandon. He said, "And the career you have now, the one you've built for 12 years, where does it trace to?" Brandon did not answer immediately. He looked at the podium surface. He said, "Charlotte." Steve said, "So without that letter," Brandon said, "I know." Steve said, "Say it." Brandon said, "Without that letter, I don't get the job." He stopped. He looked at Frank. "Without that job I don't have," he stopped again. "I don't have any of it." The studio fell completely silent for the second time. Steve said, "Frank, did he ever thank you for the letter?" Frank said, without any accusation in it, just as a factual matter, "No." Odessa looked at the floor. Not from sadness, from the specific, dignified discomfort of a woman who does not like to watch other people's reckonings, even when those reckonings are overdue. Steve turned to Brandon. He said, "You stood at this microphone 5 minutes ago and described this man as someone who didn't quite make it out. I need you to understand what I'm about to say." He paused. "This man refinanced his house twice to pay for your wife's education. He took a personal loan he spent 5 years repaying. He wrote a letter that opened the door to every room you've walked into since 2012. And he never told you he wrote it. He never asked you to acknowledge it. He just did it and moved on." He looked at Brandon steadily. "That is not a man who didn't make it out. That is the man who made it possible for you to go anywhere at all." Brandon looked at Frank. Frank looked back at him, not with the satisfaction of a man who has been vindicated, but with the steady, patient gaze of someone who has been waiting for a very long time for a conversation that is finally happening and would have been just as happy never to have had it in public. Steve said, "They built everything you have. 300 people were completely still." Brandon said, "Not to Steve. To Frank, I should have said thank you. 12 years ago, I should have said thank you, and I didn't, and I don't have a good reason why." He stopped. "I told myself I had built it myself. I knew that wasn't the whole truth, and I kept telling it anyway." He looked at Odessa. "I'm sorry to both of you. That was wrong." Odessa looked at him. She said, "I know, baby." She said it the way she said things. Without theater, without withheld warmth, with the complete, exhausting generosity of a woman who has spent her whole life having enough love to give it to people who have not earned it, and giving it anyway. Steve looked at her. He said, "You just said 'I know, baby,' after all of this. Why?" Odessa looked at him like the question was slightly surprising. She said, "Because he's my daughter's husband, and because I would do it all again." She paused. "I'd take the loan again. I'd write the letter again if Frank asked me to. I'd give them the down payment again, not because I expect anything back." She said it plainly, because that's what you do for family. Even when family doesn't do right by you, you still do right by them. That's not weakness. That's just how love works when you're serious about it. Steve Harvey pressed his handkerchief to his face. He turned away from the cameras for 4 seconds. His shoulders moved once. He turned back. He said, "Let me tell you something." He sat down on the stage floor. "I made a promise a long time ago. When I had nothing, when I had used up everything, and I was sitting in my car with no plan and no direction and no one coming, I promised that if I ever got out of that place, I would spend whatever platform I was given making sure people were seen. Really seen. The way Frank and Odessa have not been seen in 12 years by the person sitting closest to them." He paused. "I am not angry at Brandon. I was where Brandon is. I had people who gave me things I took for granted and told myself I had earned alone. I know what that story costs you. Not them. You. Because you spend all your energy maintaining a version of yourself that isn't complete, and it's exhausting, and the day it comes apart, you find out you were the only one who needed it." He looked at Brandon. "They didn't need you to say thank you to know their worth. They already knew. You were the one who needed to say it." and you're saying it now. That counts. He stood up. He pulled his phone. He called the regional director at Brandon's company, a man named Gerald Okafor, who had been Frank's contact at the plant 30 years ago, and who was, improbably, still in his position, and who answered his cell on the fourth ring. Steve said, "Gerald, I have Frank Pickard here." There was a pause. Gerald said, audible through the speaker, "Frank Pickard. I'll be damned." Steve handed the phone to Frank. Frank and Gerald talked for 90 seconds, old colleagues, the shorthand of men who worked the same floor for a decade, the specific warmth of people who liked each other before either of them had anything to offer the other. Frank handed the phone back. Gerald said, through the speaker, "You tell Frank that letter he wrote was the best letter I ever received. Bar none. I tell the story all the time." Steve ended the call. But Steve wasn't done. He announced both families received the full prize. He said it quickly. Then he turned to the competing family, the Johnsons from Birmingham, whose matriarch, a woman named Bernice, had been watching all of this from the right podium with the composed attention of a woman who has raised 4 children and knows what the important moments look like. Bernice walked across the stage. She went to Odessa. She said, "I see you, sister." She walked back. Steve turned to the camera. He said, "I want to talk to every person at home who has received something, from a parent, a spouse, a family member, a stranger, and has folded it into the story of what they built alone. I want to talk to every person who has a Frank in their life and has called him salt of the earth like that's a small thing." He paused. Salt of the earth is not a small thing. Salt is the thing that makes everything else taste like what it is. Salt is what preserves. Salt is what you cannot live without. He looked at Frank. That man is the reason. Whatever room you're in, that man, or someone like him, is the reason. And if you are lucky enough to know who your Frank is, say thank you. Say it today. Say it out loud. Because he already knows his worth. You're the one who needs to hear yourself say it. The clip that went viral was not the confrontation. It was not Brandon's apology. It was Odessa saying 4 words, "I would do it again," because something about those 4 words, said without performance by a 65-year-old woman who had every right to say something harder, broke something open in people that they could not close again. The clip of those 4 words alone was viewed 44 million times in the first week. The full episode clip was viewed 217 million times in the first month. The hashtag "I would do it again" trended in 44 countries for 12 days. Marriage counselors shared it. Family therapists shared it. A professor of social work cited Odessa's sentence in a lecture on unconditional familial obligation. Several people wrote publicly that they had called their parents after watching it. Brandon Hewitt called Frank the morning after the taping aired. The call lasted 42 minutes. Neither man has said much publicly about what was said. Brandon said, in the one interview he gave, that Frank talked mostly about Tanya as a child. Stories Brandon had not heard. Things Frank had watched his daughter become. He said, "He wasn't punishing me. He was just finally talking to me, like I was worth talking to." He said he drove to Frank and Odessa's house the following weekend and sat at their kitchen table and ate the food Odessa made and did not check his phone once in 4 hours, which Frank said later was the most impressive thing he had ever seen Brandon do. The Debt We Carry Foundation was established by Steve Harvey 6 months after the taping, dedicated to family financial literacy programs, elder care support for parents who have depleted retirement savings for their children's education, and community recognition programs for blue-collar workers whose contributions to their families' upward mobility are systematically under-acknowledged. The motto, from Frank's words, "It's good to remember what things cost." In its first year, the foundation served 1,890 families across 31 states, funded 340 elder care support programs, and partnered with 8 universities to embed family financial transparency workshops into freshman orientation curricula. Frank still has the portfolio. He brought it to Tanya and Brandon's house last Thanksgiving, and he left it on the kitchen counter when they arrived because he had decided, after 12 years, that it did not need to travel with him anymore. He said, "I think it lives here now." Tanya put it in the bookshelf in the hallway, not in a closet, on the shelf, where people can see it when they walk by. Brandon walks past it every morning on his way to work. He has not moved it. Someone kept a worn leather portfolio for 12 years and carried it to every meeting that mattered, because he had learned that documentation was the only argument available to people like him in rooms built for people unlike him. He wrote a letter on plain white paper and mailed it on a Tuesday and never mentioned it again. He refinanced his house twice. He took a loan he repaid ahead of schedule. He gave the down payment without condition. He stood at a podium next to a man who called him salt of the earth like that was a small thing, and he folded his hands and said nothing, because he had known his worth for 68 years and had never needed anyone else to confirm it. He just would have liked, once, for someone to try. Have you ever stayed when someone expected you to keep score? Have you ever given without condition when keeping the receipt would have been easier and justified? Share your story in the comments below. If this moment moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the people who build us are not diminished by our forgetting, but we are. And ring that notification bell, because more stories like Frank and Odessa's are coming, and every one of them belongs to someone whose worth was never in question.